everyone, this is Sarah back in my Real Food Kitchen after kind of a long hiatus. I got busy, whatever. So I'm back, and it is winter in Minnesota, and if you follow the news you know that we have had temperatures plummeting well below zero for quite a long time. And when I contemplated what to do to get started again, I thought, how about a number of breads and pastries, because the idea of filling my home with warmth and the smell of bread just felt very comforting. So today I'm going to make something that I think of as sort of a combination of a bread and a pastry. It's called a galette, and a galette is like a rustic tart. And the nice thing about a galette is it's very versatile. It can be either savory or sweet. And so today I thought I would make one of each. So we're going to make a potato and onion galette. That's obviously the savory one. And then pears are in season right now, so I'm going to make a smaller pear galette. So the first thing that we need to do is make the dough, and the dough requires a resting time of a minimum of an hour, but you can make it up to a day in advance. And if I had been thinking in advance, that's what I would have done. But anyway, so you need me to make it for you. Anyway, so without further ado, the dough. So a little bit about ingredients. I've become kind of fussy about my flour. So I buy this flour that is milled locally and frequently. And so when I buy it, either from their particular store or the co-op where I can buy the flour, it's very, very fresh. So of course you don't have to be so fussy, but I would, if I were you, if you have a co-op, I would buy your flour from the co-op bins, because they go through that flour very rapidly and you can be assured that it's fresh. You need all-purpose flour. I happen to have only just a little bit of all-purpose flour, and then I have bread flour, which is also called strong flour. So I'm going to mix the two, because needs must. So we need 2 1/4 cups of flour, and a little bit later I'll show you a recipe. 1. That's 1 and about 3/4. If you have been following my blog, you know that I'm a casual measurer. I don't fuss with it too much. But I should explain that I can take that point of view because I'm a pretty experienced cook and baker. So I know how things should feel. And so if I get started and they don't feel right, I can adjust appropriately. But if you're a beginner, best to follow the recipe. So I've got 2 1/4 cups of flour in here. We need a teaspoon of salt. And you just kind of stir that together a little bit. And then we are going to need both water and sour cream a little bit later, but the first thing that we're going to do is add butter in chunks of about a tablespoon each. And the recipe calls for a cup minus a tablespoon, which technically is 15 tablespoons. But I just say a cup minus a tablespoon. And what I usually do is take the tablespoon out right away so that I don't forget to, and then it's just the rest of the butter. So throw it in your flour in about a tablespoon portions. And then nowadays, a lot of people will make their crusts with a food processor. myself included. I do that sometimes, especially if I'm going to be making several crusts. For Thanksgiving this year, I made 7 pies. So I did resort to using a food processor. And there's nothing wrong with that because the blade of a food processor actually does a very good job of integrating the butter in the flour. But when I'm not doing a huge quantity, I tend to like to do things by hand, and that's just me, that's just my nature, because I get the feel of things obviously better when I'm doing them rather than a machine's doing it. So I'm going to have you come a little bit closer and watch the process until I get it to be a rice-like consistency. That's what we're looking for. All right, so here's a visual of what I'm doing. I'm just using this pastry blender, which is a cheap, like $5 gadget. And I'm using it to work the butter into the flour. And you want to use really cold butter. And the reason that you do that, and then we're going to chill this again for now, and the reason you do that is so that when it does go in the oven, the butter doesn't immediately melt and leave the flour. So don't use room temperature butter. Ironically, you'll end up with a drier product in the end if you use warm butter. And so I'm just pushing this cold butter into the flour, and I'm about where I need to be, maybe a little bit more blending. And yeah, I think that's good. So I have this sort of rice-like, some of the butter can be in the size of a small pea, that would be fine. And then while we were off camera, my cameraman asked a good question. He asked if this was salted or unsalted butter, and I use unsalted butter, and you should too if you follow my recipe because it's been formulated with unsalted butter. If you were to use salted butter and add the amount of salt that I told you to, it would be too salty. All right, so now the next thing is we need to add some sour cream and water. And I'm just going to put the sour cream in the water just for ease of mixing purposes. And like I said earlier, I'll show you a recipe at the end of this. So now I'm just going to add this in about 4 additions. And at this point, it'll be kind of difficult to use the pastry blender because the mixture is going to want to bind up on it. So I use something that's called a Danish dough hook, which is meant to mix dough, and it's well designed to do so. Kind of looser doughs probably is what it was meant for, but it works great for this. A slotted spoon would also work. You want to keep your water cold and your sour cream cold for the same reason that I told you keep the butter cold. You'll have a nice flaky crust. And you can see how it's starting to gather up. That's what we want. And as soon as I've got all of the flour incorporated into this ball, I turn it out onto the surface. I've got a section with too much sour cream in there. There we go. I'm going to put a little bit of flour on the surface, and I'm going to knead it just a couple of times. Not a lot, because it's not a bread dough. It's more like a pastry. And when something's more like a pastry, less kneading is better. All right, so now I'm just gonna gather it up and give it a couple of quick kneads. And that's good. And because it's a dough ball, it needs a little spanking. And so now I'm just going to put it in a piece of wax paper. You can put it in plastic if you want. I'm sort of not a big plastic person. I'm going to put it in the refrigerator like this for an hour, and then it'll be ready to take out and roll out. Hi, so we've got the dough chilling in the refrigerator, so now we can start working on the filling ingredients. And this one is going to be potato and caramelized onion, and then I have some herbs from my garden that I dried, which I do simply by bunching together and hanging upright like that. And so I just want to talk to you a little bit about caramelizing an onion, which I think a lot of people think means to put in a pan and fry until it's dark brown. And that's not really that's frying an onion, which is delicious, but it's not caramelizing an onion. Caramelizing an onion is to cook it low and slow for a long time, which releases an onion's natural sweetness and sugars, and then it has just it's a more complex, almost buttery taste, and not that kind of sharp, strong taste of a fried onion. So I like to caramelize my onions in a combination of mostly butter, but also some olive oil. And that just helps keep the butter from burning if I let it get too high. But we're going to try not to do that in the first place. And then I like to use a cast iron pan because cast iron is very good at maintaining a temperature over a long period of time. And so I'm just going to go ahead and put about, I guess that's probably about a quarter cup of butter. And less, maybe 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And I'm going to put this on the stove top over medium-low, and I'll show you the onions as they're progressing, but they'll probably take about an hour. So if you're used to your caramelized onions taking about 8 minutes, you are frying an onion, you're not caramelizing it. So we're going to caramelize onions, and then also there will be potatoes in this. And what I recommend whenever you're going to put potatoes in something like a quiche, or in this case a galette, is to parboil them first so that they are half to mostly done. And also the boiling process will help them retain moisture. So if you've ever noticed when you roast potatoes, chop them up and roast them, they can get kind of a dry chalkiness to them. Try parboiling them first, and they will stay very tender on the inside and then be crisp and golden on the outside. So we'll see you back in a few minutes. I thought I'd show you while we're over here caramelizing onions that when you get to about this point, when the onions have started to become a light golden brown, I usually add, in this case I'm going to add about a teaspoon of sugar and about maybe a tablespoon of balsamic vinegar. And that's going to help the caramelization process. And we're at about the halfway point here. And the kitchen is smelling delicious. And then the other thing is, once you have the onions in the pan dispersed fairly evenly along the bottom of the pan, don't over stir them. That's something that I get on my mom and sister's case, who are both over stirrers. When you over stir food that's cooking, you turn it into mush. And the process that we're trying to achieve here, caramelization, requires the onions to make contact with the pan. So don't keep disrupting that process. Just kind of put them in there and leave them alone. All right, so I'm taking, it's been roughly an hour. I'm taking the dough out of the fridge. And my wax paper stuck to it a little bit. Don't want that to reappear later. All right, done. So I'm making, as I mentioned, I'm going to make a savory one and I'm going to make a sweet one. The savory one's going to be bigger. So I'm going to take about 2/3 of it. Save 1/3 for the sweet one. So for now, that's going to go back in the fridge. I'm going to sprinkle my surface with some flour. So I like to form my dough by using the heel of my hand to push the dough out into about a, 8-inch disc. And every time you work it, when you've worked it for a few seconds, re-flour the surface. Now I'm ready to use a rolling pin. And when you roll a dough and you're trying to get a circle, you want to roll it from the inside out. And you don't want to go, I'm not actually putting any pressure right now, but you don't want to go like this, because one, that usually doesn't get you an even surface, and two, it overworks the dough. It's just a little bit too rough of a handling. I'm going to keep going until this dough is about 1/8 of an inch thick. Then I usually just kind of run my hand over it and see if I feel any spots that are on the thick side and give them a little roll. And then it's nice if you have a handy device like this, which is called a pastry blade, nice and long and thin. And you can use it to get under the pastry and help move it around. Little spot that wants to stick over there. Just patch that up. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I've got a cookie sheet lined with parchment paper. We're going to move this whole thing. Don't put the sheet on the pastry. I'm just going to move this whole thing over here. Patch up that little hole again. So now we're ready to start assembling. And what you want to do with a galette, because the edges end up getting folded over the filling, you want to leave about 2 inches around so that can happen. So the filling goes in here, and whenever I'm making a quiche or a galette, I always start with the cheese, and my theory behind that is that the cheese will melt first and form a barrier so that if there's any moisture, the cheese is going to prevent that from turning the pastry soggy. So I like to put cheese first. I'm saving a little bit of that for the top. This happens to be Gruyere. I thought it would work deliciously with the potatoes and onions, but any nice meltable cheese works well in a galette. That would include Comte, it would include Fontina. It should be a nice flavorful cheese. Like, personally, I wouldn't use something like mozzarella because I don't think that has enough flavor. So all the onions are going to go in here. I'm going to spread those out a little bit. And now I've got my parboiled potatoes, and they've chilled, and one of the nice things about parboiling them and then letting them chill is they're very easy to peel, and you can peel them without losing that much of the potato. And I'm just going to layer these in the galette. You can see how thin that is, about 1/8 of an inch. Broke a little bit. There we go. Now I'm going to put the rest of the cheese so that forms a nice bubbly top. And then I'm going to take my dried herbs, and the nice thing about them being dry and connected with a string is I just kind of go like that and let it fall where it might. I'm going to put a little bit of salt, not too much because the cheese is pretty salty. And then for color, you could put paprika, but I'm like seriously into sumac right now, which is, you know, a dried berry, just like the sumac bushes that you see around, depending on where you are in the world, I suppose. It's the berry from the bush that ends up getting dried and becomes this sort of peppery-like spice. And then you just take what's left of the pastry and fold it over like that. And then you want to lightly beat an egg and brush the top of the pastry. And then we're going to put this in the oven, a hot oven at 400 degrees, and it should take about 40 minutes. And in the meantime, I'm going to get the sweet one. We are going to make the sweet one and get that ready for the oven. I kind of like to put a little extra in the folds, help that stay together. And it's ready to pop in the oven. So now we've got the remaining 1/3 that I'm going to duplicate the same process with, of flattening out into a disc with the heel of my hand. Now, pears are in season right now and super delicious. So I'm just going to quickly prepare a pear. And I like to score the fruit, meaning I'm going to cut these sort of stripes of the skin off, leaving some of the skin. And the reason I do that, like this is what I do when I poach a pear or whatever, a little bit of skin gives it some substance still, so that it doesn't turn into complete mush. But if you leave all the skin on, it can be a little bit tough and unpleasant. So this seems to be the perfect kind of happy medium. And then I just quickly core the inside out with my knife. Like that. These are perfectly ripe. So whenever I'm going to use a pear in a tart, or like last night I had dinner with a friend and I poached pears, I buy the pears about a week before I'm planning to use them. And that seems to be perfect. So I'm just going to cut the pear in thin strips or slices. I'm going to eat this one. Yum. So what I'm going to do is put them out in the middle, not too fussy of a pattern. For this small piece of pastry, that's enough, I think. And then whenever I put sugar over something like this, I tend to like to flavor it a little bit. A little bit of cloves would be nice in there, maybe a little tiny bit of cinnamon. I happen to have some citrus sugar, because I put it in my gin and tonics. And so this is sugar with lemon in it. And I'm just gonna go ahead and cover it fairly generously because I want it to kind of caramelize in the oven. And then just like with the savory one, I'm just going to loosely fold over the sides. And then I'm going to put the egg wash on the edge. And that's ready for the oven. Just like the other one, 400 degrees, and this one's smaller. I'm going to check it after 35 minutes or so. They're done and look delicious. So this one, all you have to do is flip it onto your cutting board. This one I'm going to eventually cut right on here because I've been doing savory things on my cutting board and haven't had a chance to clean it, which, as you know, I like to do with lemon and salt. And so I'm going to cut it here so it doesn't pick up all these savory flavors. But here we have our yummy galette. Should we cut it so that we can see what it looks like inside? So a galette is something that I like to serve with soup or with a salad. It makes a great like heavy appetizer. Just as a snack, it's a great picnic food. And what I forgot to mention when I talked about the sweet ones is that any number of fruits work well inside a galette. Apples work well, berries work well. You just don't want to pick something like a strawberry that has a lot of liquid, because as soon as it gets hot, the fruit will exude all of that liquid and turn the pastry soggy. So keep your selection to less watery types of fruit. And then it's just a matter of throwing some fruit in, sprinkling with sugar, and putting it in the oven, and voila, you've got a super yummy dessert. So thanks for joining me again after my long absence. Excuse me. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you make a galette. It's such a casual, easy way to make something delicious, and you can whip up both dessert and your main course at the same time. I hope it's warm where you are, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. And as far as, you know, sometimes I like to recommend a beverage. With this particular one, onions, potatoes, cheese, that sounds like a beer to me. In fact, I'm already started.